perfectly to your good job resources. Earlier this year in the Appropriations Committee, you testified that you were, for 2024, your budget was $500 million below what you needed to sustain your 2023 efforts. A few minutes ago, you talked about foreign terrorists. The last few weeks, I know information has emerged. That information came from FISA information that was able to be collected overseas on these possible terrorist threats. What we have here today is a domestic terrorist, what looks to be a lone wolf. Your statements, there's nothing really there that would have tipped anybody off to this individual. Is that what I'm hearing from you?
Well, I don't know that I'd go quite that far because we're still investigating a lot related to the shooter. It does appear so far that we're seeing less in his...
My 6 seconds, I would just say, I would ask that you let us know what resources you need to protect the American public and our candidates in our democratic system.
I appreciate the question. I would just say this. We are in, as I've said consistently today and for quite some time now, we are in an elevated threat environment covering a wide range of threats, and the FBI is central to protecting the American people from those threats. And state and local law enforcement, who depend on us every day, rely on us for all sorts of services, databases, forensic support, training. I could go on and on and on. And a lot of those departments, unlike the FBI, have had a hard time recruiting. And so this is not a time to pull back on our funding because we're going to leave our brothers and sisters in state and local law enforcement twisting in the wind, and then by extension, the American people we're all collectively sworn to protect.
Thank you, and Mr. Chair, I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas, recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Director Wray, for being here. When did you last speak with President Biden?
I don't have the exact date, but it's been certainly since the since the shooting.
So you have spoken to the president since the assassination attempt on President Trump's life?
Yes, sir.
And what was the mental state of the president?
We had a perfectly professional conversation.
And are you, do you have any scheduled briefings of the president upcoming?
Not at the moment specifically scheduled, no.
In 2016 and 2015, top FBI officials infamously texted about, quote, their insurance policy to make sure Trump was never elected or inaugurated as president. Have any FBI agents texted, emailed, or expressed disappointment that Trump survived the assassination attempt or otherwise editorialized about the assassination attempt?
I don't know about any agents. There have been at least 2 instances, I think, or 1 instance of an individual who posted something that I consider outrageous and totally inappropriate and unacceptable. And that individual has been referred to our inspection division, which is the arm, our sort of internal affairs investigatory arm that does the disciplinary process.
Okay. Will you report back to this committee any other incidents?
I'll do my best to share information with the committee.
You testified earlier that the FBI maintains high standards irrespective of so-called diversity efforts. Is it true that in December of 2016, former Director Comey lowered the passing standards for Phase 1, allowing an influx of previously unqualified applicants to continue in the hiring process who normally would have been stopped back in December of 2016?
Yeah, I can't speak to Director Comey's
what were the
changes. I can tell you that at least since I've been director, changes that we have made to...
we're standing on a specific question. Were standards changed? Phase 1, this is a specific part of the process. Were they changed in 2016?
Well, I don't recall if they were changed in 2016. Obviously, I started, as your question presupposes, after that. What I can tell you is, since that time, we have made changes to various phases of the process, but none of them, this is important, none of them lowered the standards. In fact, if anything, they actually increased.
Are you familiar with reporting that we have, and we've asked questions to you about this, I'm not sure the result of the questions, that to more, quote, easily accommodate a large pool of available applicants, FBI special agent hiring standards have been relaxed and requirements measurably lowered. This according to a group of former agents who have testified about this and written a report and submitted it to Congress. In addition, specifically, minority, people with 20-year careers, one in particular, a minority served for more than 20 years, wrote in this report and submitted it to Congress saying that these standards were in fact lowered, and that in fact, if you were hiring, you were moved off of hiring if you put quality above these kinds of DEI requirements. Do you reject this report? And do you have comments on this report?
I haven't read.
You're aware of the report.
I'm aware of the report. I know that I've read every detail of it, but I can tell you that the claim that we have lowered our standards to be less selective and less competitive is not accurate.
So do you believe these former agents are lying to Congress when they submit a report to Congress stipulating and suggesting otherwise? Or are you saying that they are lying?
I'm saying they're mistaken.
Okay, but they're affirmatively on the record. They're telling us and submitting a report to Congress saying that those facts are directly in contradicting what you're testifying here today. So I just want to be clear so we know we're saying that they are submitting evidence to our record to the contrary that you say is untruthful.
I encounter all the time when I travel around the country and have conversations with our agents, and one of the things I try to do is have meetings with some of the longer serving agents without executive management.
That's okay. My only question is that,
and my point here's
the implication is it's untruthful. So but I need to move on. I got 1 minute left. Are you familiar with the case of Paulette Harlow? She's a 75-year-old elderly woman from Massachusetts with a debilitating medical condition. She was prosecuted for violating the FACE Act and sentenced to 2 years in prison. She has to go to Texas in 2 weeks. She was praying at an abortion clinic in Washington, D.C. The FBI interrogated and investigated her. Do you think it is appropriate for a 75-year-old woman who is praying at a clinic in D.C. to be put in prison for 2 years for that activity? Just a simple question. Do you think that's appropriate?
I'm not familiar with the specific case.
You're not familiar with that case. It's been significantly in the headlines. But you don't know how to comment on that case, that it's appropriate for a 75-year-old woman to be put in prison for 2 years for praying at a clinic.
Again, since I'm not familiar with the case, I don't want to start weighing in because I don't know all the facts. But what I can tell you is that when it comes to FACE Act enforcement and abortion-related violent extremism, I think one of the things that gets lost, and I appreciate the opportunity to clarify it, is that really since the Dobbs decision, actually more of our abortion-related violent extremism investigations have focused on violence against pro-life facilities as opposed to the other way around. And we've had a number of investigations. We're using FACE Act resources and our JTTFs.
We're still waiting on responses on letters that we've sent indicating the data to the contrary, that there's been significant amount of efforts in targeting of people who are pro-lifers who go to clinics, and that they've been prosecuted, like this case, a 75-year-old woman who is now going to jail in Texas for 2 years because she was praying at a clinic in Washington, D.C. And we've submitted questions on that, and I'd appreciate a response on it. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Director Wray, for being here and for the work that your team does, as well as for sharing the information that you've been able to today. You just got a couple questions about that seem to imply that there was some problem with the FBI's diversity efforts, and certainly the 1950s version of the FBI was singularly Caucasian male agents, et cetera. Is the FBI a better force for having a diverse range of employees and agents?
I think diversity makes us better, but like everything else, it has to be done the right way. Mm-hmm. I think we can have a more diverse workforce and do it without lowering our standards, and that's, in my view, what we've done. And
you haven't lowered standards at the FBI?
We have not. I repeatedly come across people who are confused about different parts of that, and I appreciate the opportunity to set that straight.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we're all concerned here as we've seen the rollout of this Project 2025 that purports to try to eliminate any reference to diversity efforts across the entire federal government. So it is sort of a top-of-mind concern as it's threatening to become reality. So what I did want to talk about today is something some of my colleagues have mentioned, which is the normalization of threats and violence against public servants at all levels, whether it's election workers or school officials, elected officials and their families, judges, federal law enforcement agents, and others. To be clear, I think it's very clear that the majority of Americans wholeheartedly condemn any sort of political violence and understand that it's not legitimate discourse and that it has no place in our civic life. But words do matter, and they have consequences, particularly when uttered by people in positions of leadership. So that's why I remain very concerned by the willingness of some members of Congress to repeat disinformation and conspiracy theories that undermine trust in our public institutions which serve all Americans. And when elected officials embrace overheated or fact-free rhetoric, it becomes dangerous. I have been heartened, as many national leaders have unequivocally condemned calls to violence, and I would urge all members of this body to do so and continue to do so, regardless of the party affiliation of the perpetrators or the targets of such threats. You and our other national security officials have repeatedly warned us that foreign actors are actively working to spread disinformation, to influence our elections and discredit our public institutions, and we shouldn't be aiding and abetting them. So to live in a country that we aspire to, where our most valued democratic processes like free and fair elections can be carried out unimpeded, and people can run for office, serve their communities, and exercise their right to vote without fear of violence, we've had some concerns about violence around our elections. In 2020, the endorsement and promulgation of falsehoods about the election results by the former president and his campaign led to threats and attacks against election officials and poll workers in Pennsylvania. And those falsehoods also wasted millions of taxpayer dollars on frivolous lawsuits and extraordinary security costs. So as we're again approaching November, our neighbors and our nonpartisan civil servants can do that important work free from conspiracy theories and threats. So we know our local law enforcement across Pennsylvania are preparing for some disruption and threats because while Pennsylvania may be a battleground state in the upcoming election, that battle should obviously be a war of words over policy and the vision we're charting for our country's future, not an actual civil war. So how is the FBI working with state and local law enforcement to prevent and respond to election-related violence, particularly against election workers?
So in a variety of ways, we're partnering with state and local law enforcement. Obviously, the physical security in the first instance, in most of the respects you're talking about, is in the ordinary course, the responsibility of state and local law enforcement. But we play an important role in a number of ways. So we share, threat bulletins, information like that about things to be on the lookout for, things we're seeing. If we ever have specific threat information, then we work to get it to the right people. We have election crime coordinators, which we've had for decades in all 56 field offices who have existing relationship with not just state and local law enforcement, but election officials, especially focused on security and threat-related issues. And then, of course, we're participating in the Election Threats Task Force that DOJ set up, which is focused on threats of violence or actual violence against election workers specifically. And we've had a number of arrests and even some convictions already on that.
Okay. Thank you for your input. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, Director. It's my intention to go approximately another half an hour. Then we will break for the Prime Minister of Israel's address to the Congress on the floor, give you a chance for lunch, and then resume after that. But we'll keep pushing through for the next half hour if we can. Gentlelady from Indiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director Wray. I think you have a little bit better tone in conversation, so I appreciate it, and answer some questions, so I appreciate it. Hopefully you'll answer also on 2 letters that I sent you over a year ago, one related to Durham report, and the other one related to Russian-infiltrated SBU that collaborated with FBI. So hopefully we'll get these answers, and hopefully we'll start doing authorization. Don't you think doing authorization would help us to get better answers? Congress should probably work in authorizing new agency. Don't you agree with that?
We work very hard to try to get information to this committee and to other committees.
But authorizing spending probably would be a good thing for us to do. Don't you agree?
Oh, I'm sorry, authorizing what?
Our spending, not just doing appropriating, but actually doing authorization of spending through this committee.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. We might start doing that. But we can talk about, and a lot of my colleagues on the other side, AR-15 gets a lot of bad rap, like to bring it up, this issue. But really, there are a lot of hunting rifles that probably, maybe even more accurate than a lot of ARs. And don't you agree, we have like millions, right? Don't you agree, we have millions of rifles owned by law-abiding Americans. So do you think we should be taking them? Millions of rifles from law-abiding Americans? What do you think about that? Would that be something feasible, and really we should be doing that?
Well, again, I'm not going to be addressing anybody's specific legislative proposal. From our perspective, from the FBI's perspective, the concern is any dangerous weapon in the wrong hands.
But all weapons
in the
are
hands
dangerous.
of the wrong person.
But all weapons are dangerous, right?
I'm sorry?
All weapons are dangerous. Knives are dangerous,
Sure.
Explosive are dangerous. There are a lot of
weapons are by their very
Yeah, but are we going to be
definition
confiscating, hunting rifles and rifles for millions of Americans? Do you think it's even feasible to do something like that from law-abiding citizens?
It's not something I'm advocating.
Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate that. So we have to go back. That was a catastrophic failure of security. That what's happened, recently with attempted assassination. Don't you agree with that?
Well, I think former Director Cheadle has already publicly acknowledged that it was, I think her words were, a significant operational failure.
Then we had, similar situation, a different, talking about bad optics. Speaker Pelosi at that time didn't want to have bad optics on January 6th, and we didn't have proper security here on January 6th. That was a catastrophic failure, too. Are we looking at that? Any one conclusion was made from that? Have we made any adjustments? Because I know a lot of people, got hurt now just being here. There was a lot of cases bringing up the Department of Justice, and a lot of them were really just law-abiding Americans that really just upset with the government, and they have a reason to do it. So I think we need to think about it before we prosecute, or instead of actually, looking how we can deal with real criminals and how we can have a proper security when we have events with so many people there. So did you have confidential human sources? I think you never answered that question on January 6th in the Capitol. Did you have some?
I'm sorry, what's the question?
Confidential human sources. Did you have them on January 6th in the Capitol?
Well, again, I'm never going to be getting into when and where we
Okay,
have
are
or have not used confidential human sources. But
are you willing to stand the record that you had no confidential human sources that went into Capitol on January 6th?
as I've said consistently, I'm not going to get into where we have or have not used confidential human sources. I can tell you that if you are asking if the violence at the Capitol on January 6th was part of some operation orchestrated by FBI sources or agents, the answer is no.
No, I
And it's
didn't
a
ask you that.
disservice
I asked
to our
you, so
people.
did you investigate any confidential human sources? Did you do any investigation and looking at that? So you're not answering if you had any or not. So if you had potentially, did you do anything you needed to make sure to investigate that none of your sources did anything wrong? If they did wrong, they were prosecuted the same way, like you're trying to prosecute a lot of people that really, even in Supreme Court ruled recently that some unconstitutional charges.
Let me just add that there have now been, I think, 180 individuals who've gone to trial, in addition to the 850 who've pled guilty.
Right, but I think the problem is you put these charges, a lot of people would put guilty.
Finish?
But let me say just quickly, because I only have 10 seconds, really. So I hope you will take seriously what you're doing. You know, related to the border security is also a crisis. You know, your vice president was a lead-in on that. Has she initiated meetings with you to lead, like weekly or monthly meeting where she actually get briefings from you as a leading border czar that had that function? Have you had that? Has she initiated any meetings on a regular basis with you?
Again,
the gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman can respond.
right. On this issue of confidential human sources, number one, I will say there is a DOJ OIG review that's underway that I think addresses some of these kinds of topics, I believe, but I won't speak for the Inspector General. Second, as to this suggestion, which I've heard all too many times, that somehow January 6th was orchestrated by FBI agents or sources, I will note that in addition to my prior comments, that there have now been 850-ish individuals who've pled guilty, another 180 who've gone to trial. They've all had access to defense counsel, discovery, all the things the Constitution and the rules provide them. It's been in front of something like 15 different judges, I think dozens of juries, and not one has given credence to this notion. And in fact, I don't think any of them have even really seriously tried to raise it. So it's not just my word for it. Look what's happening in the cases. Thank you.
The gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director Wray, for being here, for your testimony today, for the work that you do each and every day, and that your frontline agents across the country do each and every day to protect Americans, to keep our country safe. Also grateful for the work that you're doing in investigating the horrific events of July 13th and the attempted assassination of former President Trump, which everyone must and has condemned. I would first just ask, do you believe that the FBI has the adequate resources to ultimately ensure that your agency gets to the bottom of it and fully investigates this terrible crime?
Well, we are devoting massive amounts of resources to this specific investigation. We have easily several hundred FBI agents, analysts, and professional staff working on it. It involves over half of the FBI's 56 field offices, almost every headquarters division. We even have some of our overseas offices working on it. You might say, well, why is that? Well, because some of the companies that involve accounts or purchases or communications or what have you that the shooter used are foreign companies, so we have to get evidence from overseas from those companies. I've talked about our lab a little bit earlier today. We've got our Office of Technology Division working on the digital devices. We have our Behavioral Analysis Unit, our BAU, working on helping us build out a profile of the shooter. I could go on and on and on. So it's all hands on deck on this case, as I think is appropriate. Now, when you ask about our resources, I've been public about the fact that the fiscal year 24 budget put us $500 million below where we needed to be to sustain current operations. And on FY25, the current House mark would put us significantly further back behind that and would result in significant risks across every program and our support to state and local law enforcement. We arrested something like 50 violent criminals per day, every day, last year. The current mark would mean more violent criminals on the street, more neighborhoods at risk. We have about a 1,300% increase in our investigations related to China and its targeting of us. And I can assure you, China's not cutting its budget. This would mean more threats from China. We have something like 300 to 400 investigations just into cartel leadership. And about hardly a week goes by when some FBI field office isn't seizing enough fentanyl to wipe out an entire state. Those cuts means more fentanyl on the street, more people dying. So the people who suffer the most are state and local law enforcement and the American people we're sworn to protect. And so I look forward to working with Congress, but we really need to be smart about what we're doing, and I think that would be a step in the wrong direction given the threat environment that we face.
And I couldn't agree with you more, Director Wray, and of course we've talked about this during previous hearings in which you've testified, and to be clear, that I think the budget that House Republicans have proposed, which is about a $325 million cut to the FBI, would do precisely what you've described and have deleterious impacts for public safety across our country, and House Democrats are certainly working to prevent those cuts from taking place. You've talked at great length about the events of July 13. There's justifiably a lot of public interest in the investigation, which we understand is ongoing. Wonder if there's anything that you'd like to disclose or provide to the committee or to the public that perhaps has not yet been gleaned during the course of this hearing, and just give you an opportunity, because there's a lot of folks related to the investigation. Yeah.
One thing I can give an update on, which is pretty fresh here, we had some conversations with some of the members about the access to the roof and the ladder and so forth. And our evidence response teams and their forensic collection, we've now believed that the subject climbed onto the roof using some mechanical equipment on the ground and vertical piping on the side of the AGR building. In other words, we do not believe he used a ladder to get up there.
One question, if the chairman might indulge me with just a few extra seconds. There's an article recently regarding several former Trump administration national security officials who had received a duty to warn briefing from the FBI regarding the potential threat from Iran. And I think there is this article made clear deep concern that these individuals have, justifiably so, about the threat level, and particularly given the events of the last several months, and the need for there to be an increased security posture and security personnel for former officials who may very well still be at risk. And I don't know if you're familiar with that article. I'm trying not to use names here, but I think would perhaps follow up with your agency and with the Department of Justice more broadly to ensure that any individuals who are potentially facing a threat from Iran or another hostile actor in a foreign nation have the resources they need to have the security available to them.
So again, without reference to any specific individual, I want to be very clear about this because I've tried to be vocal on this, but it sometimes doesn't get noticed as much, which is that in my view, the Iranian government has been extremely aggressive and brazen. We have seen in the last few years an attempt, I'm speaking just from public information now, an attempt to assassinate a former U.S. National Security Advisor on U.S. soil. We have seen an attempt first to kidnap and then to try to murder an American dissident/journalist who's a critic of the Iranian regime right smack in the middle of New York City. We have seen a cyber attack against a children's hospital in New England that ties back to Iran. We have seen, as I've testified before, as Director Ratcliffe and I announced, an effort by the Iranians to target the 2020 presidential election. And that's all before you even get to the fact that the Iranian government is the leading state sponsor of terrorism. So if that's not enough to convince people that Iran is a threat, I don't know what is.
But Director, was there a distinction between what the gentleman from Colorado raised and what you just said, this general concern in these specific instances you talk about, and a direct specific threat on President Trump that's distinct from what you've been describing as this general concern with Iran?
Well, again, I can't get into specific pieces of class.
And if so, when? If it was a distinct threat on President Trump, when did that take place?
Yeah, all I can tell you, certainly in this kind of setting, is targeting of U.S. officials for the Soleimani strike is something that is a reality that the Iranian government has at times called for very publicly. And whenever there is reporting, let me try to answer your question this way. Whenever there is reporting about any of those protectees, we share the information in a variety of ways, working with the intelligence community, working with whoever is the protective service with responsibility for that individual, and we do it in a timely way using the duty to warn process that was just referred to. And to my knowledge, everything along those lines that's relevant was shared in a timely way with the relevant people.
Thank you. The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Director Wray, thanks for being here. Where were you when you heard that President Trump was shot, and then what were like your immediate actions, response to that as director?
I was about to have dinner with family, and I was horrified and angry.
I'm just thinking, the reason I asked the question is because I'm still trying to figure out kind of the lanes, what the FBI would respond to and what the Secret Service has the responsibility to respond to. Can you just kind of cover that again?
Sure. So the FBI is not responsible for, has never really been part of our mandate or mission for the physical security of venues, of specific protectees or anything like that. That's, if it's somebody within Secret Service's scope, that's their mandate and mission. We are a law enforcement and intelligence agency, and so if you think about it this way, we're the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We're not the Federal Bureau of Security. You might say, well, what's the difference? Well, there is a difference. We investigate crimes. We investigate threats to national security, but we don't. Questions about security posture, the adequacy of resources and assets that were deployed to protect a specific individual, whether there's enough security, and certainly the staffing of that security is not something the FBI, again, we're 116 years old, has historically done.
So at this point, have you been able to go through the shooter's home and kind of document kind of what you found as far as evidence goes?
So we have been able to search the shooter's home. So again, just sort of tying your first question to your second question now, our role is to conduct an investigation of the shooter and the attack. And so we're going to conduct a painstaking, intense investigation of that. We have, among other scenes that we've processed using evidence response teams, in addition to the rally scene itself, of course, we have been through the shooter's home, his bedroom, other parts of the house, et cetera.
Have you been able to establish that he did go to a range and either zero that weapon in or, at least target shoot that weapon prior to the assassination attempt?
So we do assess that he went to a shooting range the day before. Not the only time he went to a shooting range. He was a fairly avid, might be a little strong, but a fairly avid, shooting hobbyist. And so he went to, belonged to different sort of clubs and went to certain ranges and that kind of thing. We do believe, based on what we've seen so far, that he went to a shooting range the day before and that he shot an AR-style rifle at that range the day before. I'm not sure we know for sure that it's the weapon that he used, but I think we assess that it probably is.
Have you been able to interview his parents?
Yes, we have.
And was there anything that was gained from that interview that would lead you to believe that they certainly were aware of what was going on?
I guess I want to be careful about talking about specific people's interviews, but I would say that his parents were cooperative with us. And as I've said before, and hopefully this gets at your question, we have not identified any accomplices, co-conspirators, or anything along those lines.
So it's the FBI's position right now that he still acted independently.
Again, we're still, I know it seems like a lifetime since July 13th, but we're still early stages. But we have not seen anything so far that would suggest to us that he acted with others.
How does the FBI view not just a Trump rally, but political rallies versus other types of events, from a security perspective, compared to a college football game or any mass, large crowd type gathering? Because I think one of the things that's most difficult to really to swallow at this point is that the idea that these Trump rallies have been happening for years and that there could be such a lax approach to the physical security of those fairgrounds that day. And I'm wondering, where does this fall? And then on top of that there were other presidential candidates out there that didn't have full Secret Service protection. RFK Jr. has been the most vocal about it. I was wondering if you could comment on the facilities as well as providing security for presidential candidates.
Well, again, I want to be a little bit careful to stay in my lane because, again, security posture and the adequacy of the security posture is really the core expertise and responsibility of agencies like the Secret Service. But certainly it is, I think, fair to say that outdoor events, whether they're political rallies or, as you say, a college football game in an open stadium, a concert, these are places that are often, particularly challenging to secure adequately because the range of threats that can face them are higher. In addition to that, as has been discussed a little bit here already in today's hearing, just threats to public officials, including politicians, is an increasingly pervasive part of today's landscape. And so that adds to the challenge. So you're talking about the combination of individuals who are increasingly targeted for violence, combined with venues that are softer and harder to secure targets, I guess is the way I would answer. But again, those kinds of questions, the adequacy of the security posture, all the resources that were or were not devoted, all that stuff, is my understanding, would be very much in scope for the DHS Inspector General investigation and this outside independent panel that's been appointed.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Director, I think we're going to be able to get two more members' times of question, then we have to get to the floor for the Prime Minister. Gentlelady from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Chair Johnson, and thank you so much, Director Ray, for your transparency and your testimony today. First, I want to say my friend, and she was my friend before I even came to Congress. And in my freshman year, she kind of took me under her wing and she kind of showed me the ropes. And she was a force to be reckoned with. And I can say that she will never, ever be replaced. And she was a trailblazer, and I know that she will sorely be missed here in Congress. Director Ray, I only have one question for you today, but before we get to that point, I'd just like to reiterate today that political violence is never acceptable. Regardless of how different our political values and views are, attempted assassinations are a stain to the very democratic ideals of this nation. We have endured riots on Capitol Hill on January 6th, where a literal noose was erected on Capitol grounds, intended for then Vice President Pence and Speaker Emeritus Nancy Pelosi. Political violence against election workers, that has been expressed today. An attack on Paul Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi's husband. Threats against the FBI agents, as you have expressed, and prosecutors, and threats to the staff who serve the public every single day. Congressman Connolly's staff was targeted and attacked last year. And now we have the attempted assassination of a former president of the United States. All of this within just the last 3 years. This violence simply needs to end. The assassination attempt on Donald Trump was, by the grace of God, a failure. The weapon the 20-year-old man was able to obtain, an AR-15, generally has a shooting range up to 600 yards and shot Mr. Trump from almost 150 yards away. This weapon has the ability to kill multiple people in seconds. And sadly, Corey Compatore lost his life because of this man and because of this gun. Mr. Compatore's family will never be the same. Trust me, I understand that more than anyone else in this room. Is the near loss of a former president enough for this Congress to finally take action? Because there are 206 of us that are already standing in the wings, ready to take immediate action to ban assault weapons today. We need only 12 more of our colleagues to join us in courage and move the legislation to save lives of so many of the people that we are elected to serve by removing assault weapons from the hands of people who simply should not have them in their possession. We are crippling our democracy, and we are ripping apart our fellow Americans until we do. I ask today, because it is clearly it wasn't enough to take action when the lethality of assault weapons, we lost 26 and 7-year-olds and 6 teachers in 2012, when I also lost my son to gun violence, or 14 teenagers and 3 more teachers in 2018, nor was it enough when we lost 19 more children and 2 more teachers in 2022. Well, is it enough now? Now that a former president, the very president that many of you in this room are hoping will be reelected, almost lost his life because this Congress has failed to reinstate an assault weapons ban. A ban that, by the way, Republicans joined with Democrats to pass 30 years ago. Well, fine. If y'all don't like assault weapons ban, we can bring another bill that I have introduced to a vote, the Go Safe Act. This bill focuses on the components of the semi-automatic firearms and regulates their infrastructure, sale, and transfer. This, again, is not the time for thoughts and prayers. This is a time for action. Director Ray, just one question I have for you. Would you rather have your officers protected or protect someone against an assault weapon being shot from 147 yards away, or a standard pistol with no accessories attached?
Well, again, I'm going to refrain from appearing to comment on specific legislative proposals, but I can tell you that we have certainly concerned about the danger to law enforcement from any kind of high-powered weapon in the wrong hands. And it hits close to home for us because just not that long ago, two great agents, Laura Schwarzenberger and Dan Alphen, down in Miami, executing a search in a crimes against children case, were shot and killed by a subject with an automatic weapon. So again, dangerous weapons in the wrong hands is something that, of course, from a law enforcement perspective concerns us. But I'm not going to wade into the legislative process.
Well, thank you for that answer. I'd rather give our agents a fighting chance. And I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director Wray, for being here today. So we spend $3 billion a year, excuse me, on the Secret Service, $3 billion. And it would seem that we could and should have had a better job done a few weeks ago on the 13th than what we saw. Will you have anything to say about correcting what are the obvious deficiencies in what the Secret Service did?
Well, for the most part, the deficiencies or adequacy or inadequacy of Secret Service's performance, decision-making, resources, all that stuff is in the purview of those two other investigations. That is the DHS Inspector General and the outside independent panel that's been announced. Having said that, our investigation, which, as I've testified now, involves several hundred FBI employees and every asset we can bring to bear, of the shooter, again, our investigations of the shooter and his attack, of course, involves interviewing law enforcement, including lots and lots and lots of Secret Service people. So we'll share all that with those reviews so that they can answer those questions.
The reason I'm asking this is because this isn't the first time the Secret Service has been before Congress. There was a 435-page report issued in 2015 by Congress saying, fix yourself. They didn't. In fact, there was a follow-up in 2019 where they had only done a few of the, I think it was 18 or 19 different specific things they were supposed to do. They'd done some, but certainly not all. There was another follow-up in 2022, and again, the Secret Service had not done what Congress had asked. I guess my question to you, Mr. Director, is what should Congress do? A 435-page report 9 years ago, and still the Secret Service didn't do what it was told to do then. Can you help, Director Wray? Because this type of performance is not acceptable.
Well, I think even former Director Cheadle has acknowledged that this was a significant operational failure. If there are ways for the FBI to be helpful beyond what we're already doing in terms of our investigation, we stand ready to try to be helpful. I do want to say, as somebody who's been in law enforcement for most of my career, I've worked with some just phenomenal Secret Service agents. Going all the way back to my time as a line prosecutor, and they have an incredibly hard job, and I have a lot of affection and respect for the men and women of the Secret Service.
I'm sure you do, and I'm sure you're right. But the trouble is, when Congress says you need to do these 19 things and they don't, something needs to change. Now, the director has resigned, but you're going to be in a position, because your agency is doing such a careful review, to say a lot about what should have been done. I guess the real issue is much more of what the higher-ups in that agency are or are not doing. Perhaps that's on us.
And we will share with those reviews anything that we come across that could be helpful or relevant to them for those questions.
Yeah, let me quickly go to some details on the actual events. It appeared to a lot of us, as the Secret Service was taking former President Trump from the stage, that he was clearly still in view of everybody. And had there been another shooter, I didn't see him being protected. Are you going to raise that issue?
I think that's really more in scope of these two other reviews.
Let me go
both of them.
Okay, that's fine. Let me go to the shooter as he was on top of the roof. Apparently another officer from another police division saw him and quickly ducked down because the shooter aimed a gun at him. And then the shooter, apparently, was he prone at the time he took the shot toward the president?
So my understanding is that the local officer that we're talking about, with the assistance of another local officer, was able to kind of get up and see onto the roof where he observed the shooter, I believe, in a prone shooting position. The shooter then turned and faced him, the local officer, with the weapon.
From the prone position.
That's my understanding.
And then he went back to the prone position.
And this is all seconds before the shooter took his.
But that entire time, the shooter was in the scope sight of the counter sniper, correct?
That one I'd have to double check on. I know we've interviewed the counter sniper, but I'm not sure I know the answer.
But the counter sniper didn't take a shot until after the assassin attempted to shoot the former president and others. He got off 8 shots before the counter sniper shot the shooter. What's with that protocol? Can you get that fixed?
Well, I really want to be careful not to be, given the scope of our investigation, somehow second-guessing the very difficult act and decision it takes for a counter sniper to kill another human being in that situation.
Yeah.
It's all happening in seconds. So
8 shots.
Yeah.
And that was after he'd been seen for 20 minutes. I yield back. Thank you.
Director, that's an important question, though, because you've talked to the counter sniper. And that, I mentioned this in our opening statement, that critical 5 minutes from 6:09 to 6:14, and what takes place there is critical, and I think that's what the gentleman was getting at, and we were hopeful that you could tell us something about your interview with the counter sniper.
Yeah, I guess I want to distinguish a couple things. There is some individual, not law enforcement, I believe, who spotted the shooter on the roof a few minutes before, but I think law enforcement spotting him with the weapon on the roof is seconds before the shot.
Okay,
So
that's important.
yeah, so there's two different things.
I think what you're saying is it wasn't maybe that if the bad guy shoots at 6:11, then you're saying this encounter with local law enforcement that Mr. Bentz was just getting into happened just seconds before that and maybe not 2 minutes before that?
That's my understanding. That, in other words, that there's different things here. There's an individual, at least one individual I can think of, not law enforcement, member of the public, who observed him on the roof. Not clear whether or not the individual saw a weapon or not, but saw him in a way that was concerning. That is some number of, not many, but like just a handful of minutes. I think separate from that, as far as law enforcement goes, in terms of a weapon, this local officer that we just talked about observed the individual, again, literally just seconds before the shooter took his shots. Separate and apart from all of that, roughly, I think, maybe a little less than or around an hour before the shooting, there were local law enforcement officers who observed the shooter, not up on the roof, not with a weapon, but with I believe, a rangefinder, kind of like you would use if you were playing golf or something, in a way that was odd and suspicious. So that started happening with local law enforcement beforehand. But in terms of shooter, meaning with the weapon, law enforcement, my understanding is that the first time that happened was this local officer climbing up on the roof seconds before.
Again, we want that timeline. I think the committee wants that timeline and communications that were taking place in that short period of time.
Again, as I've said with everything else, I really want to be careful. I'm leaning in, trying to share as much as I can here. Facts are evolving, things may change, but we are working on a timeline, among other things.
Committee will stand in recess until after the Prime Minister's remarks conclude. Committee will come to order. The gentlelady from North Carolina is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much, Director Wray, for being with us yet again. As you know, we've seen a disturbing rise in domestic terrorism and far-right extremism across the United States, and we've heard from you several times about this. White supremacist and far-right extremist groups continue to outpace all types of terrorism and domestic violent extremism, according to the National Institute of Justice report from this past January. Part of this dramatic rise in extremist violence and threats stems from malign foreign actors who are actively working to sow division in American democracy. They're desperately trying to inflame extremists and deepen divides, all to support far-right agendas and candidates that will erode our democracy. The DHS threat assessment has warned, we expect the 2024 election cycle will be a key event for possible violence and foreign influence targeting our election infrastructure, processes, and personnel. Microsoft has warned that the 2024 election may be the first presidential election during which multiple authoritarian actors simultaneously attempt to interfere with and influence election outcomes. National security officials and experts have warned that foreign governments, mainly Russia, China, and Iran, seek to destabilize the United States via its elections by sowing further division in the American electorate. This is happening in the current context of increased political violence in our country against a former president, election workers, judges, members of Congress and their families, and other public servants. I cannot emphasize enough that this is a national security threat. Director Wray, reports have found that these propaganda campaigns will sometimes target racial groups. Why would countries like Russia, China, Iran seek to inflame racial tensions via social media?
Well, of course, it may vary from adversary to adversary, but the playbook for authoritarian regimes in today's world is to try to sow divisiveness and discord, to turn us against each other, to capitalize on existing social tensions that they perceive, and to try to, in effect, pour gasoline on the fire and intensify those conflicts that may already exist in our domestic, political scene. So rather than, if you're a foreign adversary that means us no good, rather than try to come up with some completely brand new issue or theory or narrative to turn us against each other, you look for things where we're already, at the very least, quarreling with each other, if not fighting with each other, and then they try to capitalize on that and amp it up. And of course, that can then sometimes, as we've seen all too tragically, boil over or bubble over into outright violence.
And so how has the FBI worked to combat this propaganda and infiltration on our social media networks?
So our focus is on the foreign actor, China, Russia, Iran, and on their efforts. And so we work with the intelligence community, we work with our foreign partners, our friendly foreign partners, to try to uncover what those countries, Russia, China, Iran, are up to. And we try to share information about the hidden hand of the foreign actor where it's appropriate. We also engage in efforts to disrupt those foreign actors. The most recent example with the Russians, for example, is a Russian government-linked generative AI social media bot farm where they were posing as, among others, U.S. persons and not, in fact, U.S. persons, and trying to, again, sow various narratives. In that case, very heavily focused on the issue they picked there was, the war in Ukraine, and again, trying to kind of get everybody turned against each other. We've also seen that, though, from China and Iran. I mentioned China before. We've had a case where we charged, I think it was 34 Chinese Ministry of Public Security, MPS officers, for much the same kind of behavior, creating false personas, pretending to be Americans, and then trying to kind of sow narratives. In that case, in the Chinese case, their narratives were trying to, for example, undermine any suggestion that COVID was the product of a lab leak, or attacking U.S. law enforcement at the anniversary of George Floyd's death, for example. And then Iran, in 2020, we saw them undertake similar kinds of efforts that were disrupted in the I think, October of 2020.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Director Wray, thank you for being here, and thank you for the information that you've provided today. I greatly appreciate it. This event that occurred, the attempted assassination of President Trump on July 13th in Butler, Pennsylvania, was a level 5 alarm alert to this country that that our elected officials, our leaders, the president, the former president, are not safe, and we need to reevaluate from the ground up exactly how we are to go about providing that protection. The information you provided dealing with 8 cartridges from the roof, the drone, the fact that 2 explosive devices were found in the car, 1 at home, that was a remote detonation device that he had on him, the fact that his phone was using encrypted platforms. He only had 1 phone, correct?
Oh, sorry. He had 1 phone, although we've identified other phones that he may have used that may not have been his phone. So, for example, we think in certain instances he might have used his dad's phone. Again, not necessarily related to the attack, but we're trying to make sure that we process and exploit every device he could have used. And we keep, which is part of why I keep making this point, which I know you all are probably tired of me making about this being an ongoing investigation, because we keep identifying new pieces of equipment, new accounts, what have you.
And the fact that you are in real time informing us about what you're finding as you're performing this investigation is very helpful, and clarifying the fact that he went to the range a day before and shot an AR. Now, my understanding is that the AR he used on the 13th was his father's. Is that correct?
Well, yes and no. It was originally, his father bought it legally, but then our understanding so far is that his father then conveyed it to him, sold it, in fact, to his son. So originally his father's, at the time of the shooting, the shooter's.
Okay, so that's new information. Was that provided to you by the father?
I think it was partly from that. I think we also saw some documentation to support it.
Okay. Investigators also have said that the shooter posted, quote, July 13th will be my premiere, watch it as it unfolds, on an online gaming platform sometime before he tried to assassinate President Trump. Can you confirm that, and how much time elapsed between this posting and the attempt on July 13th?
So I'm really glad you asked about that, because that is a situation where, again, in our effort to give real-time information, since we've provided that information, we have since learned that July 13th premiere, profile page on the gaming platform, it turns out it was not the shooter.
Okay.
That it was some other individual as part of some sick joke who, after the shooting, created a profile page pretending to be the shooter.
Wow.
And so, of course, that person is now admitted to it, and but anyway, my point being, among the other challenges that we as investigators have, you have people who create accounts in today's world, create accounts pretending to be somebody that they're, and it's not the actual person.
Now the
so
shooter,
that's troubling, obviously, and it makes our jobs even harder as investigators.
Thank you for clarifying that. Did he have an online gaming account?
We do believe he was a gamer, and that he had different kinds of gaming accounts. So that's part of why
Any information gleaned from those?
Not yet, but again, some of those legal process returns I'm still waiting on.
Now, during the attempted assassination, Crooks was wearing a T-shirt from a popular YouTube channel. Have you been able to access his selection of YouTube videos that he's watched?
I believe we have seen some of his search history, but I think we've got a ways to go on that. I know there's some manual work that we're doing on that. I think the most notable thing that we've found recently, which I don't think has been shared until today, is that on a laptop that the investigation ties to him, that on July 6th, it revealed a Google search, and his search, if it was him, again, it's a laptop tied to him. We obviously believe it's him, but we'll continue to investigate. But his Google search was, how far away was Oswald from Kennedy?
Right.
And
horrifying.
Yes, absolutely.
Can you clarify that you have in your possession all of the video that was taken on that day at the scene?
We've collected mountains of video. Part of the reason
you commit to providing us with that video?
Well, we're going to work with the committee and share information as best we can. Part of the reason I hedged on whether we have it all is, as you can appreciate in today's world, everybody with a phone
Sure.
has the ability to take footage, and so we're finding things kind of left and right.
You have all the law enforcement video.
I believe we have all the law enforcement video, but we're still collecting evidence.
Okay. And I hope you would provide that to us and to the American people. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Director, just to be clear, the photo and the message on the online gaming account, I think your testimony was to Mr. Klein that was somebody else posing as the shooter. Is that right?
Correct. Somebody after
the
July
fact.
13th
Okay.
created this
That's
profile, pretending to be the shooter, and sent us down a rabbit trail, which we've now tied off.
That's important information. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director Ray, for being here. And I want to add my voice to the chorus of folks who are just devastated by the illness and passing of Sheila Jackson Lee. What a champion. What a role model. I always called her the hardest working member of Congress. She was everywhere on every issue. She'll be greatly missed. Director Ray, I thank you for what you said earlier, which is leaning in. This is such an extraordinary set of events. The attempted assassination of Donald Trump, the stealing of the life of a father, a firefighter, somebody who protected lives, Corey Comparator, serious injuries to 2 others. So I thank you because you are trying to give us what you can without jeopardizing the investigation, and I think that's very helpful. Did the shooter also investigate other high-profile folks? We had heard some reporting around that early on.
Well, you say investigate other folks. I think this is a place where we still have a lot more work to do. Part of what we did find was a bunch of cached images of a variety of public figures. But again, cached images are those images that you get when you pull up a news story from any number of news sites. If there are photographs in the article, those images are automatically put into the cache on your computer. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you were searching for that person's image. We do have the fact that starting around, at the least around the period early July, so the search that I just mentioned related to Oswald and Kennedy, that's about July 6th, which is the same day we believe that he registered for the rally. And the day before, he traveled to the grounds for the first time. And so I think there is a certain amount of searches related to former President Trump that during that period we're seeing, consistent with some kind of planning or reconnaissance, if you want to call it that, in advance of the rally. But that's sort of confined to that, or concentrated, maybe is a better word, in that July period, after the announcement of the rally and before the shooting.
Can you speak to the conveyance of the gun? So this is a 20-year-old young man. His father owned the gun originally, AR-15, am I correct?
AR style, yeah,
AR
style
15. 20-year-old man. When did the father sell the gun to him? And what documents do you have? How much money transpired? What date was it?
Yeah, I do know that, I know, we believe, based on what we've seen, that his father, after purchasing the gun legally, sold the gun to his son. I don't know that I have the date of that transfer or the amount of the transfer, although we may be able to get that to you as a follow. I just don't have it in front of me.
Do you know when the father bought it?
We know. I don't, as I'm sitting here testifying in front of you, I don't have that in front of me, so I don't have it at my fingertips.
I'm just wondering if it's proximate to this event.
I do not believe that the gun was purchased, that is the gun that was used. I do not believe it was purchased particularly close in time to the shooting, but how far in advance? It may have been a year before, give or take, but again, we'll go back and double check that on you. I do know that on the day of the shooting, at about 1:30 p.m., he bought 50 rounds of ammunition. So if you think about the day of, or if you back up a little bit, so the day before he goes to the shooting range, the day of he goes to the grounds the morning of the event for, I think, around an hour. He buys the ammunition at around 1:30. At around 3:50 is when he's back on the grounds of the rally, and that's when he used the drone that I've talked about already today. And then, of course, fast forward till just after 6 o'clock when the worst happened.
And we had thought maybe over the weekend there was a conversation around a classified briefing for members. I hope that will happen as soon as it's feasible for you and for the other agencies involved. And he got off 8 shots, and the reporting is that that was in under 6 seconds. He got off 8 shots, fatal to one. My question that I'll leave you with, and I know I'm over time, Mr. Chairman, is we all decry political violence. We decry any violence, but we decry the rise in political violence. What can you tell us that we could do better? What do you need for you to be able to help this country reduce the political violence tendencies?
I think this is a moment where, in the most stark way possible, all of us as Americans can see how out of control political violence is in this country. And it's an opportunity for everybody to come together and to try to show that this is not the kind of thing we're going to tolerate in this country. The FBI's role is to focus on violence and threats of violence. But there is a role for others in the public square to address how people communicate in this country. And every day in our jobs, we see in social media, in terms of threats that we get, thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of tips reported to us, and the language that's out there is just mind-bogglingly hateful and violent sounding. People sometimes, as figures of speech, use expressions that are very violent expressions, and so that is a part of it. We can all do better in kind of being a little more thoughtful and measured in our language. But again, the FBI's, we got to stay in our lane. Our lane is the violence and the threats of violence. There's a role for everybody as Americans to try to see if we can take the temperature down.
Great, thank you. And thank you for the extra time. I yield back.
Gentleman from North Dakota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I really appreciate you correcting the gaming thing about this is my coming out party, because we're asking you to do something, and we've had acrimonious, you and I have actually had acrimonious, but we're not here for a gotcha moment. We're just not on this. And we're asking you to give us information before the investigation is complete. My only recommendation or suggestion would be when that happens, don't necessarily wait till you ask, because don't wait for us to ask. Because and I'll go through why in a second. I appreciate you coming in. I appreciate you telling us things. I appreciate you guys going against essentially your normal policy of waiting until an investigation is done, because the American people need to know it. But here's why. There's a guy with a rangefinder walking around that everybody noticed and then couldn't find. He's scaled to the top of a roof within 150 yards line of sight to the Republican former presidential candidate by climbing a drain pipe, and then you said some equipment. He was being pointed out by rally goers everywhere they could, and nobody could figure it out. There's maybe supposed to be local law enforcement in the building, either upstairs or downstairs, and all of this is going on. And I was talking to a colleague of mine yesterday on the floor, and it's like, I hate the conspiracy theories that come out, but this is not the FBI's purview. This is the Secret Service's purview. This is so comically inept to the average North Dakota citizen. Is just, they look at this and they're like, how could this possibly happen? And so by you giving us information in a really meaningful way, even though we know the investigation's ongoing and things can change, that at least helps us to deal with that and figure out where we're at. And so, and you're doing all this. This guy had no combat training, no counter surveillance training that you're aware of, right?
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite hear that.
He had no combat training.
Oh, No, not, I don't think any, certainly no what we would call, what you and I would call combat training. Obviously, he was a fairly active recreational shooter, so he did plenty of shooting.
A lot of guys.
No, not, I don't think any, certainly no what we would call, what you and I would call combat training. Obviously, he was a fairly active recreational shooter, so he did plenty of shooting.
A lot of guys in Western
Yeah.
North Dakota, right? I mean, all of those different things. And somehow we came within under of an inch of a presidential candidate being shot and killed within 100 days out from an election. And when you look at it, so I just want to be really clear, because there is a lot of this. There is no evidence of another shooter, right?
I mean, another shooter.
Yeah.
I mean, there's the counter sniper who took out the shooter.
Well,
right. But you're talking about like another.
Anybody else. And you're looking at his online and seeing all that, but there's no evidence he had any other accomplices on scene that day, correct?
Correct. Not that we've seen yet, certainly.
And you said, Oversight's had a hearing, DHS had a hearing, we're having a hearing now. The Inspector General's going to investigate. We're probably announcing a bipartisan outside panel. But there's another investigation too, right? Because somebody has to clear the shooter. Like, even though it is a Secret Service officer deploying his, I mean, when an FBI agent kills somebody in the line of duty, what's the process?
So we have what we call an agent-involved shooting, is I think what you're getting at. And we have a whole process.
Usually get put on leave, paid leave, get a lawyer, depending on how it is, right?
Some of those things depend, but we have, our inspection division does a shoot review of each time when there's one of these situations. And they sometimes have to coordinate with local prosecutors who are also doing some kind of review. But so yes, Secret Service would have a similar kind of process for the counter.
I mean, because you have to actually establish one of the defenses to homicide. Just like, I mean, you don't do it in a court system the same way everybody else does, but you have to justify that shooting was justified. So when the FBI does that, do they conduct that all internally?
Most of the time, yes. Every once in a while, there's a situation where the Inspector General gets involved.
Do you know how the Secret Service does it?
I don't.
Okay. And I just think that's important, because when we're talking about how this works, and I don't think anybody is arguing it wasn't, anybody who's seen it knows what happens, but it's just knowing it and making sure that the process is handled correctly. And I just want to shift gears with my last 30 seconds really quickly, because we had a hearing on the northern border in Grand Forks, and you were talking about specific threats from Iran, but also generally. And we've diverted an exceptional amount of resources at the southern border. Our interactions, 114% increase in apprehensions. And the one specific thing, with all due respect to these real issues with terrorist threats than it is to the United States, particularly Iran. And are you guys monitoring that and making sure whatever coordination you have with Canada, that we're paying attention to that as well?
We have an excellent relationship, we the FBI, with our Canadian counterparts, both RCMP, the Mounties, as some people euphemistically call them, and CSIS, they're my intelligence service counterparts. We have great relationships with them, and terrorism is, I find, probably the #1 thing we talk about.
Yeah, they're understaffed and overworked on the northern border, and they can use all the help you get. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, thank you for today. I think I greatly appreciate your candor. I know it's highly unusual to go into this level of detail during an active investigation, and I know it's a special and unique circumstance given the nature of what happened that day. I'll ask my colleagues that we not try and take advantage of this in other circumstances. I think we need to be careful about pressuring our investigators, to disclose information in the middle of an investigation in a casual or routine way. But thank you for what you've done here today. I do want to mention this too. Like Congressman Correa, I went up to Butler with Homeland Security Committee, and had a chance to meet with a number of the people there, including people who were there at the rally. And several of them were elected officials. In fact, one of them that spoke with me a lot was sitting directly behind Mr. Trump when he was shot, and she had video that she'd taken, and she'd love to share it with you all. But she mentioned a couple of things, too, that I hope you all will have a chance to have conversations about. And I know some of it's going to be in the Secret Service lane, some's going to be in the FBI lane. But one of the things she talked about was the fact that the day before the shooting, she and other officials in the town and people who just wanted to prepare the stage showed up and started working on putting the bunting up and decorating it. But the point she noted was that none of them had been vetted. There was nobody there to keep an eye on them and make sure that, you know, everything that was being done was appropriate. And she actually sort of thought in this in the context of hearing that a gun was found, or a gun was perhaps hidden at the site before the shooter was able to get it and use it. I don't know those details, but those are some of the things that came up that day. She also mentioned that there was sort of the outer perimeter. So you had a perimeter around the stage that the Secret Service had set up. Beyond that, you had a field, and then you had the building where the company was, and the shooter got on the roof. Apparently, there was a sort of a second level of a perimeter there that wasn't particularly restricted from an access standpoint, as with the street that was just beyond that. So she raised, and another elected official raised as well, issues about security that may actually kind of get into what you're talking about, whether the ladder was there, how the guy got on the roof. There are all sorts of issues with respect to that. And there was a lot of people, as you said, that had videotape. I talked to 3 that were showing me videos while I was standing out there in the grounds. But I had a couple of questions to ask of you briefly. Apparently, there was no Secret Service recordation of communications during that day. You know, there's no radio runs, we call them, but there's no tapes. Do you know if there are any recorded conversations among law enforcement from that day?
I don't know the details of that. I believe there may be some, but I don't have in front of me exactly what we've seen or heard.
Okay. And then with respect to email communications, there were a lot of issues about, you know, because my personal view, having gone to the site, was that they just shouldn't have had the rally there. It should not have been permitted. I thought there were just too many roofs. You know, he picked one, but there was like a half dozen others that he could have picked on the other side of the field. And as Eli Crane, a congressman who was a sniper for the U.S. military, said, there was a water tower that actually would have been a better site, probably that Secret Service should have used, but could have been used as well. But had the lead up to that decision, and Congressman Correa raised this, who made this decision about how to pick the site? And apparently there was back and forth between local law enforcement, Secret Service, and the campaign. And I was kind of curious as to whether that's something that your investigation is going into or not.
So I think that primarily falls within the scope of the 2 other reviews, that is the DHS Inspector General review and the outside panel, independent panel that's been announced. Certainly we are interviewing law enforcement personnel, but the security preparations, the adequacy of the security preparations.
That's the other lane?
That's the other lane.
All right, I only got 15 seconds left. Quick question for you with probably not a quick answer, but this scenario is kind of the worst case scenario from a couple of standpoints. Got a lone wolf shooter with no red flags that we've heard of so far. You know, nobody should have known that this was coming. He didn't have a criminal record and that sort of thing. Easy access to an assault weapon. I had a discussion like this with, I think, Congressman Roy and Congressman Bishop several months ago. What is it we can do to try and preempt those kinds of scenarios? We've got gun violence all over the country, including in my district. This is one example, but, you know, this scenario is the worst possible that I can think of from the standpoint of no intervention prevention efforts that can be put in place to try and address it. But I'm kind of curious if you have any thoughts to the contrary on that.
I don't know that I have any magic solution to the problem, and I certainly don't want to be proposing, you know, legislative ideas. That's not really my role. Certainly, dangerous weapons, especially high-powered weapons, in the hands of the wrong person represent a real concern for law enforcement, including to law enforcement sometimes as the victims, as we saw very tragically down near Miami with 2 of our agents killed. But that's probably all I can say on that. I do, while we're on the subject of firearms, Mr. Chairman, I have an answer to Congresswoman Dean's question. I might as well give it now, which is about the purchase of the firearm. I'm told that the father purchased the firearm in 2013, so quite a while ago, and then he sold it to his son in October of 2023.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back, and thank you, Mr. Director, for your great work.
I'd ask unanimous consent that we enter into the record a statement from Representative Kelly and some questions for the Bureau. Representative Kelly represents Butler. Actually, that's his hometown. So without objection, those will be entered into the record, and we'll make sure you get those, Director. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I begin, and this is not directly with you, actually, I just wanted to straighten something out. I know my colleagues, the gentlemen and the gentleladies from Georgia, Washington, California, Pennsylvania, they all mentioned Project 2025. Well, I don't know how they expect you to know about that, number one. I'm pretty damn involved. I don't really know a whole lot about it. But President Trump has made it clear, and we're going to say it again, we'll say it over and over again, that there are some things he disagreed with, some things he agreed with that he wasn't that familiar with. It was from the Heritage Foundation. And that was just raw politics, to be honest with you. It was just because 2025 has some things in it that they believe are really going to offend American people, and it very well may. And so they want to pin it on the presidential candidate. He didn't author it. He didn't condone it. He didn't put his seal of approval on it. It's getting old. It really is. We do this with other things. Just like in this committee, when anything goes wrong, anything, somehow Donald Trump's name has to be brought into it, and it gets tiring. It's politics over reality. Second thing about picking the site, I was intimately involved in the Wildwood rally, the biggest rally President Trump's ever had, biggest political rally in the state of New Jersey. I had spoken to the president about it, and he wanted to do it on the beach because we had over 100,000 people. And let me tell you, we had everybody out there because they were concerned, the Secret Service and the local police and the county police and just about every entity could be. And so they had, behind it was that iconic setting. They had the Ferris wheels on the pier and all the stuff. They had agents up in there. They had agents in the ocean, in the water, in boats. They had people coordinating, working with each other and talking with each other because they knew it was a risk. So we chose a site that was difficult. The president did, and I thought it was a great site. But nevertheless, the law enforcement responded properly. Something went wrong here. You can't blame this on Donald Trump as well. The site was chosen. It's the responsibility of those who serve in law enforcement to make sure that he was safe, period. And I'm sure you'll find out why. On another tangent here, you know, I've got to wonder how many qualified people were passed in order for Director Cheadle to get her 30% quota. That's a lousy way to run an agency, especially when it's dealing with law enforcement, to say we've got to have 30% of anything. And I worry about these practices because it's policy over protection. And Director Wray, I know that some things were left to you. I understand that. But one of your early acts on the Biden presidency was hiring the FBI's very first chief diversity officer. And since that time, and even before your time, and you're going to disagree with me, but respectfully, I'm going to disagree with you. Recruitment standards under your lead has resulted in deterioration in many areas, including physical fitness, illicit drug use, financial irregularities, mental health issues, full-time work experience, and integrity. And I know you dismissed them, but in October 2023, they are a prestigious group of retired FBI special agents and analysts both expressed concern regarding the FBI's willingness to recruit agents that, quote, I'm not saying this, they said it, not me, can't even pass the new relaxed standards for fitness, who are illiterate in some cases and need lessons, educational lessons, don't want to work weekends or after hours, their words, and have serious disabilities or mental health issues, which is not the place for them. Most of your agents are great people. I love them. I love them for what they do. I'm not criticizing most. But these new standards, Don't you think this is a hindrance and reduces the morale of the vast majority of good people that you have in the FBI? And I ask you for a quick answer because I have a few other things.
So I respect our retired agents. Many of them come to our graduations now, and I can tell you emphatically that they are those who think that we have lowered our standards, whether it's on physical fitness or anything else, are mistaken.
And you can prove that.
The facts back me up on that.
The standards are the same today as they were a decade ago.
I'll give you
they've changed in some ways that are appropriate.
In fact, the physical fitness standards, depends on how far back you go, but the physical fitness standards that our current graduates have to graduate from Quantico actually exceed some of the physical fitness standards that were in place if you go back far enough with some of our retirees. But what I would tell you, I think part of the reason there's confusion, and again, I accept that these folks are raising their concerns in good faith, but we have actually access to the facts. And part of the reason I think there's confusion, just take the physical fitness thing as an example, is that before you had to pass the physical fitness test before you showed up to Quantico. Now you have to pass it in order to get a badge at Quantico. The standard hasn't changed. You still have to pass the same test, the same 12-point standard, et cetera. All that stuff applies. The only difference is you can pass it while you're at Quantico. But if you don't pass that same test that's been in place for a long time now, you don't get a badge. And we will dismiss people from Quantico, and we do, who don't pass that
Director, I know
test.
I have to wrap this up, and I appreciate that. If you could get us information that substantiates what you say, that should be easy enough to do to the whole committee. I'd appreciate it. You know, feelings in this administration are more important than functionality. It's resulted in a border crisis. We don't have time to talk about that. You've spoken out about it. I appreciate that you've spoken out about it. I think it's also resulted in shortages in our nation's law enforcement and our military, and I think it makes us less safe. So I look forward to seeing those statistics and that proof, because I have people talking to my ear that tell me otherwise, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Wray, I appreciate you being here today, and I certainly appreciate your forthcomingness and giving us information that I think that the American people want. And, you know, to me, you have a very difficult job right now. In the past, and under Comey, certainly, the Russian collusion narrative got out pretty heavily, and that came out of the FBI with the FISA warrants and that sort of stuff, spot on General Flynn. And then the laptop issue, the Hunter Biden laptop issue, which the FBI actually had in their possession. So I have 800,000 people thereabouts that I represent, and our job is to restore trust. And so in a lot of the hearings we've had this week, they say, well, the FBI is investigating that. Every answer was the FBI is investigating this. And so in some ways it kind of landed in your lap, and I appreciate you being here. But, you know, it's just, for me, the question of how does a 20-year-old acting alone get a long gun, a rangefinder? We know he bought a ladder. I guess he reconned here and realized he didn't need the ladder to get on top of the building, so he left it at the house. Get on a roof within 150 yards of one of the most famous people in the world, I guess now, and a former president. How does that happen? And how do we restore trust in the American people at the FBI and the DHS, who is under Mayorkas's directorate now? How do we verify and get trust back to the American people that these agencies are really working to protect the president? And I'm not trying to place blame specifically, but I never thought that we'd raid his house. I never dreamed that they'd raid a former president's house. I certainly never imagined that they would actually indict him. And I felt, well, they'll never find him guilty. And now we've had a threat on his life. So how do we restore trust in the government of this country and the agencies that are here that we pay and provide $3 billion a year to the Secret Service to protect some of the leading political candidates in America? That's a lot. I'm sorry. That's a lot of questions. But I'm going to give you a little room to talk.
Right. No, listen, obviously you included a lot, as you said, in your question. And as you might imagine, I disagree fairly strongly with a number of parts of it. But sensitive to the time, I guess what I would say this. I can speak to my approach to running the FBI. Again, the FBI was not involved in the physical security of the rally. That's, we come in as the investigators afterwards. And as I've said before, our investigation is an investigation of the shooter and his attack. There are separate investigations, the Inspector General of DHS and this outside independent panel that's been announced that would be looking at the Secret Service's performance. And those, I think, will be important to trust and confidence, if you will, in Secret Service. But from the FBI perspective, we can't promise that everybody's going to like the results of what we do, right? What we can promise is that we're going to do our best to do the work in the right way. That's all we can do. And so I keep telling our folks every day on this and on everything else, our focus has to be, we got to do the work in the right way. We got to make sure we do the work in the right way, and then no matter who likes it, because everything we do, somebody doesn't like it.
And it's a credibility issue at this point. Do the American people trust what the FBI and the DOJ is going to tell them? And, you know, that's the thing with this. When I was early on, and I've only been here about 3.5, 4 years now, but the American people was the fear of the weaponization of government. So now we have this issue. Tucker Carlson asked the president, he said, are you afraid they'll kill you? And I remember that interview, and I thought, wow, I can't believe he went there. But here we are. And so as we work through this process, I think it's so important, and I think the chairman hit on this, is the audio of the shooter. You've interviewed the sniper, the Secret Service sniper that took out the target. Was he waiting on a green light? What was going on, and why did Mr. Crooks have a chance to get off 8 rounds? And we knew he was on the rooftop. I don't know for how long, but we know he was a marked target. So was he trying to get the green light, and was somebody not giving it to him?
So again, the performance, the adequacy of the performance of Secret Service will be the subject of the Inspector General investigation and this outside independent panel. What I can tell you, and I'm glad you asked the question, because this goes to something that that was part of an earlier exchange. The first time that anybody from law enforcement saw the subject on the roof was a few minutes before the shooting. Not with a gun. They didn't, at that point, they didn't, but local law enforcement, a few minutes before, saw him on